Hello, everyone, and welcome to Growing Together, a gardening podcast with me, John Lamb, and Don Kinsler, a lifelong gardener and the North Dakota State University Extension horticulturist for Cass County. Don, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. Well, we're in September.
We're in September.
Yeah, how's everything around your yard and garden?
It's good. It's good. I finished one project. I probably got a couple more. Went out and bought some more plants. I moved some of the hostas that I said I was
Did you labor on Labor Day?
I did labor on Labor Day.
Too.
Sam said I didn't understand the meaning of the holiday, but
of the day off.
I thought it was a day off from paid work to do housework that I could enjoy. So it was fine.
Yeah, good.
But yeah, we're our past Labor Day now, but there's still some gardening things that we can get out and get to. In fact,
good gardening month.
It's a good time to get into some of these things. We're going to talk about that today.
And, it's fun because September here is the prime time and kind of early September, as we can. It's the absolute prime time to dig and divide peonies and iris and daylilies. And, of course, those are some of the staples, the backbones of our perennial gardens because they're so long-lived. And, so they just are such features. And so, let's kind of talk about how we can dig and divide.
So, why is this such a great time? Let's start there.
Oh, well, that brings up a good point. Yeah, why are we doing these this time? And it gets back to the prime time to dig and divide any perennial is the season opposite its bloom time. Because when a perennial is blooming, that's the time it's most sensitive, and it doesn't want to be disturbed because producing all those flowers and in blossom, that plant's a little more tender. And so we select the season opposite. For example, peonies, they're blooming in late May, early June. And so we divide those in the fall, September. And iris, they're usually early June, mid-June, kind of the early part of the season, basically. And so we dig and divide those in August and September. Same thing with daylilies. Daylilies are quite forgiving. You can almost do those anytime, but the recommended time is late summer and early fall. So we kind of get away from the bloom time, and so that's why these items are done now. I could mention, too, that, we're talking about digging and dividing existing. From garden centers, the potted plants can really be planted almost any time, but today we're going to focus on kind of the nitty-gritty of digging and dividing those this time of year.
So why do we want to be doing that? What are the reasons?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, why do we even monkey with these established
They're growing,
plants?
They look great where they are.
Exactly.
Maybe?
Well, a couple of reasons. As these plants grow, iris, peonies, daylilies, they're clump formers. They slowly increase in clump size, slowly growing outward. And eventually, the center of that clump can start to die out. So the good growth and the good blooming growth is on that outer perimeter. And so if you're looking at iris, daylilies, or a peony, and if you see that inside becoming devoid of foliage or blossoms, it's time to dig and divide. So that's one reason is if the center is no longer performing the way it should, the center of that clump. And second reason is, maybe you've need to move them. Maybe the shade trees have grown and the peony is in shade and no longer blooms the way it is, or maybe you just don't like the spot that you planted them in.
Or sometimes you have to cut a tree down or limbs fall and you get more sun.
More sun, and so maybe a perennial isn't in the preferred sun location. So sometimes you just, or sometimes I plant things where I decide I shouldn't have planted it there, and so I'll move it. Or another good reason is if you want more of them. For example, I enjoy buying some new iris from time to time, a new color. And, they can be a little expensive, so I maybe just bought one of that. And as they increase in size, in about 4 years, that clump, I can divide it and get more of them. So right now I have a beautiful yellow sunny yellow iris, just absolutely beautiful, big blossoms. And it's in a clump now that is big enough that I can divide so I can have more of that. Maybe your friends and relatives want some of what you've got. So that's another good reason too. So those would be the main reasons for why we even do this.
So what would you need to do this? Is this just a simple shovel activity, or do you want some more? Do you want some more? More equipment?
Well, you could use either a a spade type shovel or a spading fork. Yeah, now it's interesting. When I grew up, as I was growing up, my mom was the main gardener, and a spade was a spading fork.
Okay.
But then later, many people I learned, were calling a shovel, a pointed shovel, a spade. So anyway, now I call it a spading fork or a shovel spade.
Okay.
So anyway, either one of those, something that's going to be good and sturdy to dig these up. I used to use a spading fork. I overused it. I pried where I shouldn't have been prying, and I broke the handle of my spading fork. And so now I use a spading shovel because that's what I've got on hand. And a pruning shears, a handheld pruning shears, and then also a wash tub or a big plastic tote. And I'll explain why we need those in a minute. I kind of like the big, round, galvanized wash tub just because they kind of have kind of an old nostalgic thing, but I mean, a plastic tote would do the same thing.
Yeah.
And when we get into it here, I'll describe why we need that, but something that holds a fair amount of water.
When you were talking about the kind of like the tools, I was thinking like a big long handled shovel, but really these don't have deep root systems, right? So you don't have to dig deep. A lot of these, like I know irises, a lot of times you will see kind of the bulbs of the irises
almost sitting on the surface. Yep,
right?
Exactly.
And daylilies are really not big. So you don't need
most of these will be the peony. The one that you maybe have to struggle digging with would be the peony. But you're absolutely right. You don't need massive excavation for iris and daylilies.
Right.
And let's see, labels. Labels are important. Buying some at the garden center. You can make your own labels too out of plastic milk jugs. You can make your own too. But the reason I mention labels is if you've kept track of what the cultivar name is, that's important because then over time you can look that cultivar up, and that's interesting. And also, if you're going to share them with others, it's nice to keep track of that cultivar name. Of those. And so, for example, a peony, if you're sharing that, and if it's the nice old-fashioned Sarah Bernhardt, it's nice for people to know, or nice to you yourself to know, because even though that's a nice one, it does also tend to plop a little. Yep. And so then if you give the Sarah Bernhardt to someone, they'll know, I'll put a peony cage around this one so it doesn't flop. So some labels, that's always a good idea. As long as we're mentioning labeling of perennials too, one thing I've found is that if I just put the label on a perennial anywhere, as they increase in size, you can put the label down, and sometimes it tends to get lost down the foliage. I always put the label on the north side of a perennial.
Okay.
Because then they're less apt to fade in the sun. And also, when I'm looking at that clump of daylilies and trying to find out which cultivar it is, I know to look on the north side because sometimes it's down under the foliage or kind of in there. So I know where to look. So I always label on the north side.
Smart.
And that's just kind of one little trick that somebody taught me that is fun to pass along.
All right, let's take a quick little break. When we come back, more with digging and dividing some perennials.
Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month. You'll get unlimited access to the news you need to stay engaged and connected to your community. Visit inforum.com/subscribe now to get 3 months of local news for only 99 cents a month.
All right, let's start. We're talking about digging and dividing perennials. Let's start with irises. What do we need to know there?
Well, probably the first thing is how often could we expect, or should we expect, to dig and divide iris? And they will grow better and continue on. And I mean, you can perpetuate iris forever. But eventually, after about 3 to 4 years, all the good stuff is on the outer perimeter of that clump. The inside is less prolific. So anyway, iris are fascinating in that they have an enlarged stem called a rhizome. Sometimes they're nicknamed bulbs, but they're not bulbs. A true bulb is like an onion bulb or a lily bulb. But these enlarged kind of fleshy organisms right under soil level, are called a rhizome. So iris, as they grow, kind of move outward or increase outward with these fleshy rhizomes. And when you dig up an iris, you see that underneath these fleshy rhizomes that are right about soil surface, the true roots, the fibrous roots that go down, are right under that thickened rhizome. And the leaves arise out of that thickened rhizome in kind of a fan shape.
Yep.
The leaves that you see on an iris are kind of outward like a fan shape. So that's how they grow. And as they grow, you see that inner part, the older rhizomes, tend to just be kind of sitting there. Sometimes they'll even rot a little, and all the good stuff is on the outside. So to keep iris going really, really vigorously, every 3 or 4 years, it's not a bad job. It's kind of actually an easy job. And so when you're looking at a clump of iris, okay, so it's maybe 4 years or maybe it's gone a long time. And so you're looking at that big clump of iris. So here's how you start. You take your shovel or your spading fork and just dig around the outer perimeter of it, so that you're going to be able to lift up the thing. Now, here's a good question. Should you lift up that whole part of the iris? You see, when you dig and divide these, it's probably going to take 2 years before they come back into bloom again.
Okay.
They may not bloom that first year after you reset these, dig, divide, reset. And so if I've got a big clump of iris, and if there's a corner of that still looks pretty good, I will sometimes leave that corner in place because that will bloom next year. And, next year is normal, so I'll have some blossom on it. And I'll dig out about 3/4 of the clump that looks like it needs rejuvenation. So I'll oftentimes leave a corner of that in place. And then maybe next year divide that. And in the meantime, my new planting will be taking off. A good reason for digging and dividing, not just iris, but daylilies or peonies, is because they can get perennial weeds enmeshed down in that clump so easy. Dandelions, tree seedlings pop up in between. Sometimes they're so intermeshed in there, it's hard to pull them and hard to deal with them with a weed killer because you could damage the rest of the good plant. And so this is a golden opportunity to dig up that clump and get the weeds out, separate the wheat from the chaff.
Okay.
And so I start at the outer perimeter of the iris patch that I want to rejuvenate. Start at the outer perimeter, dig down about probably a shovel depth down or so, and go all the way around. And then if it's a big wide clump, you maybe can't lift out that whole big thing, but you can take your shovel or spading fork and kind of go down in between, maybe a half of the big patch, something that you're going to be able to lift out manageably. Okay, so I go all the way around, and I've learned, because I've broken lots of shovel handles. I broke my spading fork handle. I've learned not to over pry until the clump is ready to come out. Yeah. So work your way all around. Maybe you need to go around another time, and then gently pry down. And when it looks like that clump is ready to lift out, then you lift it on out. And then now here's something that an old gardener taught me. Okay, so you've got this big old clump of iris. Okay, so in that big old clump, you're going to see some of the internal old rhizomes that aren't producing leaves, and you'll see the new, and it's one of those things that when you're looking at it, you say, oh, I see what Kinsler meant. So the nice, new, thick, newer fleshy rhizomes are on the outer perimeter, and they're the ones that have the nice fan-shaped leaves coming up. And so what an old gardener taught me is this, and here's where the wash tub or the big plastic tote comes in handy. Okay, fill that up with water, and then you take that big clump of iris, it's got soil underneath, and the fibrous roots are all in that soil. Maybe knock off a little of the soil underneath as you can, but a lot of soil is clinging on into that clump. So you take and submerge the clump down into your wash tub of water. and work it around a little bit. And pretty soon the water is softening up the soil and getting all that soil off. So that does a couple of things. Weed seeds that are in that soil waiting to happen, they'll get washed away in that soil as the soil comes off. Also, any perennial weeds, dandelions, dandelion roots that are in there, tree seedlings that are growing in there, you can see those as the soil gets washed away. You can see those, they'll pull off. And also, the roots will tend to release out of that clump. You know, for example, if you cut down through that clump with a knife or pruning shears, you're cutting off some of the roots. You're severing the roots. Whereas once you get this big clump and the water is softening all the soil, you're able to pull the clump apart, pull the good part out, and the roots become no longer intermeshed. You know, you can tease the roots outward so that these good clumps, the good rhizomes with the leaves attached, will come out with roots attached.
Kind of like detangling in a way.
Exactly. Yeah. The water, and as the soil loosens and washes away. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'll remember that term, detangling. Yeah. And so then to separate, so you look for the nice, newer, how do you do show and tell on a podcast?
Right.
But it's one of those things you'll know it when you see it. So you see the nice, fleshy, healthy looking rhizomes, and you can cut those from the old withered mass. You can cut those, or they'll oftentimes just break there's natural kind of joints at those places, so you can just break them off. I kind of like that because sometimes a knife can spread rotting organisms from one spot to another, so breaking off works well. And so you, from a clump, and I did this just this last weekend. I had an old clump of burgundy iris, and the weeds were growing in it. So anyway, I just did this. And from one clump, I don't know, it was probably a clump 3 feet by 3 feet.
Okay.
But I got dozens and dozens of good, fresh rhizomes. So I had some to give away, and as well as replant. So then you separate those off. And when you've got the nice, healthy iris divisions, you cut the leaves back in kind of a fan shape. And when you order iris or buy them at the garden center, and in the fall of the year, you can buy bare root iris at the garden center.
Okay.
You know, during the season, they're potted up, but oftentimes you can buy bare root ones in the fall of the year here. And you'll usually see those kind of cut neatly in a fan shape, about 4 inches from the top of the rhizome. Works really, really well. And let's see. So now when you go to replant these iris divisions, and what I like to do is plant about 3 to 5 in a clump of one color.
Okay.
For example, these beautiful golden yellow iris that I want to do, I'm going to plant them in a clump. I can divide my one clump. And when I replant them, I'm going to do a clump of those, a bigger clump, a new fresh clump. And each of the iris divisions, I'm going to set about a foot apart. What that will do is I'll have a brand new, rejuvenated, bigger clump of those beautiful golden yellow.
Are you saying that you'd set the clumps a foot apart, like a clump of 3 here?
Each of the divisions.
A clump of, okay.
Each of the divisions, I would set each single division, I would set about a foot apart.
Okay.
And then all of those together would form a fresh new clump or patch. Patch is maybe a better word. And the reason for that is instead of just planting one, if you plant individuals kind of in a nice new patch, when they're blooming, you get more bang for that buck because you'll have, especially from a distance, you'll have a grouping of that same color, kind of almost a mass planting or a mini mass planting.
Yeah, the impact of that, to see that just such a kind of a
key
mass
word, the
there,
impact. Yeah, much, much greater impact. So when you're dividing iris like that, by locating individuals in that new patch, more than just one, you get that impact. And so that's fascinating. So if we talk about the actual replanting now, okay, so you've dug up the old patch. Okay. And so get all the leaves and trash out of that if you're planting it in the same location. The same would be true if you're planting it in a new spot. Spade the area up good that you're going to plant or replant them into. Incorporate organic matter like peat moss, compost. Now is a golden time to get the organic matter up. And almost all perennials benefit from organic matter. Whenever you read the books or the tag, they almost always say that a certain perennial enjoys organic matter. And that's just a trait of most perennials. Is that they just love organic matter. So this is the time to work that in to them. And then, so when you're going to plant these iris divisions, you'll notice you've got the thickened fleshy rhizome, and then below that, attached right below it, are the fibrous roots. So when you plant these, the finished product should be so that rhizome is barely covered with soil. It's okay if it's even a little visible at soil surface. We don't want to get those planted deeply or they'll rot. Because you see, the only part really that needs to be below soil are the true roots, which are those fleshy things underneath the thickened rhizome. But I like to plant them just barely covered with soil. I don't leave them exposed, but just barely covered with soil.
How do you take into consideration that, because when you barely cover it with soil, probably after a watering or two, that soil's going to compact. It's going to go down.
Yeah, it'll settle. Sure.
It'll settle. Sure.
And so that's why when I first plant them, I do cover the rhizome with a little soil.
Okay.
And so that when watering, it will settle down, but yet won't leave them exposed, overly exposed.
So when you plant them, you do want them covered, but just barely.
Exactly. Yeah. Barely covered enough so that when you water and settling, they aren't going to look like they're sitting on the top of the soil when they shouldn't be. And so what's kind of neat, and when you look at a lot of the literature, you'll see, okay, when you're planting the iris, okay, dig kind of your hole, but then put a fistful of soil down in that hole. Again, we're not talking a deep hole. They get planted pretty shallowly. So, kind of dig your shallow hole, but then put a fistful of your soil down in the bottom of that hole, and then set the iris rhizome on that clump, and then the roots will fan down on either side of that.
Okay.
See, because the roots are down in kind of a fan shape also, the roots, and so you kind of fan them out over that little central clump of soil, and that just kind of helps to get the roots outward, instead of sitting in just a ball underneath.
Yeah.
And so then you plant your iris divisions, and then very important to water them in after planting. Even if the soil was a little bit moist, still that watering will get good soil to root contact and just start them off well, because they will root in. They need to root in and establish. And that's why these perennials that we're digging, dividing, we do it now rather than waiting too late into the season, because they do need to send out their roots and get themselves established. And so a newly planted iris patch is just a sight to behold, because you've got these, they're neatly cut. The leaves are cut down to a fan shape, and they're spaced about a foot apart within the patch, and it just rejuvenates so beautifully. And even though they may not bloom this next year, but then they'll be in their glory the next year. And if you've got more than one iris type, or you might kind of stagger the years in which you divide them, so you don't have to totally renew your whole patch every year.
Yeah.
But boy, that renewal really does help. And and of course, mention labeling. I love keeping track of the cultivars and the colors. And so at least even if you don't know what the cultivar name is of an iris, at least if you're sharing them, if you can tell people it's a lavender one versus a bright yellow.
Yeah, just give them a little bit.
Yeah, give them a little bit of a guide to go with.
All right, that's great. Let's take a quick little break, and we come back more with transplanting daylilies and peonies. If
you're loving this podcast, be sure to check out our full lineup. From news and local politics to sports and true crime, find your next great listen right now at inforum.com/podcasts. That's inforum.com/podcasts.
Okay, we're back. We're talking about digging and dividing plants. Let's talk about daylilies now. Daylilies, like we said earlier, they're kind of also a shallow-rooted thing. So is this similar to the irises, or are there differences?
They're somewhat similar, a totally different structure.
No rhizomes, right?
Yeah, no rhizomes. What you find underneath the daylilies when you dig them up are kind of thickened, fleshy roots, but they look more like, I guess, what we'd call a normal root system, a little more fibrous. But you do find some thickened roots under there as well. But they've got an interesting growth habit too. The leaves pretty much all arise from a central growing point at the soil surface. I guess we'd call it the crown of that daylily plant. And as time goes on, they kind of increase outward. And so, if your daylilies need dividing, especially if the inner part of that clump is bare and you just don't see anything. I suppose as a rule, most daylilies, probably every 4 or 5 years, maybe 6 years would benefit from renewal, digging, dividing. There are daylilies that stay in place for many, many years. But if you ever notice, and you could probably leave them in place as long, but if you ever notice that they're no longer blooming the way that they once did, you see, sometimes if they get too crowded, the competition, the self-competition will prevent them from blooming as much as you'd like. So if you ever notice a decrease in bloom, then good indication that it's probably time to dig and divide. So now, as we mentioned with the iris, do you dig up that whole clump, or do you just dig up kind of a part of it? Now, daylilies will take a couple of years also to get back into blooming, and so that's why I like to stagger the division of the different daylilies we have so that you don't totally renew the whole thing every year. And so it's probably better for the daylily clump if you just dig up that whole clump and then divide. But you could probably leave a portion of the clump in place, and that undisturbed clump will probably section will probably bloom next year. So that would give you some blossom. And then in the meantime, the remaining part of that big clump, you can divide and kind of get it rejuvenated. And so again, a good time in your daylilies, a good time divide to get the weeds out of them. If there's tree seedlings popping up in the middle, this is the time we'll be able to get those out of there. So let's talk a little bit about, how do you actually start digging this clump? Well, just kind of like you did the iris with your shovel or your spading fork, go around the outer perimeter. Kind of chopping down through the soil a little ways out, because the roots on these do extend a little ways out. So start at least a few inches out from where the leaves are rising. I maybe start at least 4 inches out. Could maybe go a little farther too. But and so dig down around. If it's a very big, huge clump that you're not going to be able to lift that whole thing, you can put your shovel, your spade right down through the middle of it and step down. And so you're kind of separating it physically, separating it with your shovel, and then continue to dig around the outer perimeter, digging down, stepping on your shovel, and try prying outward. Not breaking the shovel handle again, but and then when you see that clump or feel that clump lifting out, it'll come out with the roots, leaves above, of course, and the big root mass coming out in a big clump.
Okay.
And so then that's when the wash tub again comes in handy, or the big plastic tote filled with water. So you take your big clump of daylilies and submerge the root system down in, and work it around a little bit. I do try to, before I submerge it, get some of the soil off.
Yeah.
But it doesn't all come because it's interlocked in the roots. And so then down in the big wash tub, so I start kind of working the clump, get the soil to kind of starting to come off. And then you'll see some natural divisions where this daylily has increased in big clump size, but also there's kind of little divisions within that where you can kind of see how it multiplied. And then you can start breaking that big clump apart at some of those natural divisions and untangle the root system, kind of tease it apart. And you might have to separate some of those natural sections, separate down through them with a knife or a pruning shears, and then untangle the roots, tease them apart. And then, gosh, a clump of daylilies, I bet you could get 24 at least, maybe a lot more, of nice, fresh, new divisions. And so then once you do tease these apart, untangle them, you've got a nice new division. Cut the leaves back to, I suppose, 4 to 6 inches. And if you've ever bought bare root daylilies, excuse me, they will usually come with the leaves cut back.
Okay.
Yeah, to around 4 inches or so. Then, once you've got your divisions, your time to replant. If you're planting them in a new area or resetting into the same area and just rejuvenating it, same as we did with iris. Spade the soil up really, really good, add organic matter. When I say add organic matter, over the top of the patch, you could put 2 to 3 inches over the top and then work that in really, really good. And so then when you dig each little individual hole to put the daylily division back in, make sure you fan out the roots good so they aren't just in one tight little ball squished down into a hole, but fanned out. And again, I like planting them in groupings, individual plants within a grouped clump. And spacing, I suppose, about a foot apart again.
Okay.
So when I'm doing Primal Scream, a daylily, which is one of my favorites. Well, I love the name, but it's a very intense orange, vivid orange daylily. And so when I'm planting those, I like to reset a grouping of 3, 5, 7 plants. So when I'm rejuvenating that big clump, that's what I'll put back in our fresh divisions, 5 or 7 in a grouping. Or if I'm moving more out into a new area, new perennial bed or area, again, I'll plant that grouping because when they are blooming, then instead of just one Primal Scream plant, I've got this whole multiple grouping blooming. And it's the impact. It just gives such a beautiful, beautiful impact. And then after planting, water very, very well to settle it down in. Oh, the planting depth. We mentioned on iris where you barely cover that rhizome with soil and then it'll settle down. And with daylilies, you can usually see at the point where leaves meet roots, you'll see that spot kind of where they were at originally in the soil. So you plant them kind of at that same depth, kind of a little easy with daylilies, the leaves above soil, the roots below soil, and that kind of spot in between, that crown, right at about soil level. And water very, very well. Label them as to the color and the cultivar name if you know it, and then you're good to go. They might skip next year. A lot of perennials require that year after division just to make up their good, recompose themselves.
Right.
And then,
it's
of course,
kind of
they'll
like
be
a
good.
surgery.
Exactly.
It's a recovery period.
Recovery. Exactly. Yeah. And so then you're good to go on those.
How about peonies?
And peonies. Now, how often do we do peonies? Peonies can stay in place for a long, long, long time. So they need dividing. They require dividing much less often than iris or daylilies. Iris or daylilies like rejuvenation more frequently. A peony plant, as long as it's blooming well, and as long as the center hasn't started to die out, a peony plant is best left undisturbed. There are pioneer homesteads that have peonies still existing there that have probably been in place for many, many years. And peonies that are on cemeteries rarely get dug and divided. But occasionally, a peony plant will open up on the middle so that all the good stuff is on the outside and it's no longer blooming. Or maybe a peony, since they do stay in place many years, maybe a tree that was very small when that peony was planted now is overtopping it and shading it out. So you may want to dig it and move it and divide it at the same time. And or sometimes they just don't bloom the way they did. If I was to give you a figure as to how many years would you dig and divide a peony? Again, I watch carefully. If they're blooming well, don't do anything. But if I was to give you a time, 10 years, 15 years, digging, dividing a peony, because it takes them a few years to get back into gear. And so less is more with a peony. But when they need it, they need it.
Okay.
And especially if any rot or anything has started up with those. So let's talk a little bit about the meat and potatoes of digging and dividing a peony. Okay. The root system on those is different. It's than iris and daylilies. They're deeper. And what you find when you dig up a peony is big, thick roots. They're not very fibrous. They're almost like big chunks of wood almost underneath.
Okay.
And, kind of thickened roots, and they're deeper. And so when you start digging around the perimeter of these, go down maybe as deep as you can, at least the depth of a shovel, maybe more. So you start cutting down all around the outside perimeter of it, staying out beyond the leaves, and then eventually you'll feel that big peony root mass lifting up. If it's a great big huge old peony, you can, as I mentioned with some of the other perennials, you can stick your spading fork or spade right down in the middle of that peony plant, step down good, repeat that kind of along a line, step down good, and then make that great big clump more manageable into 2 clumps or 4 clumps. And so you don't always have to take out that great big, huge, big mass if it's a big old one. And so when you can start lifting that out, then do so. And it's kind of amazing. You'll think, gosh, that thing is growing from this. There's not even really many fibrous roots to it. Just big clumps. And so again, take it to your wash tub, wash it really good, get the soil off of it, remove the weeds, remove the grass that may be encroached, because you'll be able to see the grass roots in there. And so you'll be able to separate the grass out of it. And then you'll see in the underground big massive roots, you'll see what are called eyes.
Okay.
I love that term, eyes. The eyes are the buds of a peony. They're next year's growing points, the buds of a peony. And they'll be pink or whitish. They're kind of little pointed, and they're very visible. It's one of those things that when you see it, you know it. And so you look for those eyes, those rounded, pointed buds down in that big root system. And once you get all the soil washed away, then and kind of pull apart on this big root mass, you'll oftentimes find some natural divisions that it will just kind of pull apart with. Now, or sometimes you have to take a big sharp knife or a saw and saw down through. Now, each division on a peony should have at least 3 to 5 of those eyes on it. And an old peony plant, you can get quite a few divisions, but do make sure that each division has that number of eyes, 3 to 5 eyes that you visibly can see on it. Clever, huh? Visible eyes. And so anyway, then once you get it divided like that, then peonies can become quite each peony plant becomes quite large, don't they? So we don't space those a foot apart like you would iris or daylilies. Instead, each peony plant kind of needs to be kept a little bit individual. So if you wanted a grouping of peonies, no closer than at least 3 feet from the center of the plant to the center of the other one. No closer than 3 feet. Farther is fine. The planting depth, of course, work up the soil. Again, if you're replanting it in the same spot, work it up really good. Incorporate organic matter. If you're moving it to a new spot, or you've divided it, and now you've got 4 good peony plants, maybe more, and so you're going to plant more. Make sure you work up the soil really, really good. Add the organic matter, and now the planting depth on peonies is crucial, because if it gets planted too deeply, they can refuse to blossom. And so what you do is, on that division, look for the uppermost eye, the uppermost bud, and the final product has to be with that uppermost bud about 1.5 inches below soil surface.
So pretty specific.
Yeah, fairly specific. Give or take 0.5 inch. If it's 2 inches, probably okay. 1 inch is probably going to be okay. But kind of try for that 1.5 inch depth. So the final product needs to be at that. And so allow a little bit for settling. So maybe go for more like the inch, and it might settle down to 1.5 inches, because the soil that you've worked up underneath, that's all going to settle a little bit. So you don't want to settle it too deeply. So I'd maybe try even more for like 1 inch, and it'll maybe settle down to the 1.5 inches. Sounds like we're splitting hairs, but really, really important on that. And so you just, fill in with soil, backfill around the root system, and the leaves can be cut off now, as we did the iris, we did the daylilies. You can cut the peony leaves back now at this time to probably 6 or 8 inches above ground level, maybe even a little shorter than that. And so then backfill with your good soil and water it thoroughly. All of these perennials can be mulched. Now would be a good time to put your wood chip mulch, shredded bark around. And then you should be good to go. Now, peonies reward our patience. A new peony division, or even when you plant a new peony, if you've bought bare root peonies, a big potted peony might come into blossom sooner. But, it could take 3 years, 4 years for a peony to start blossoming, but then it'll be there for 100 years.
When you were talking about that, because peonies are so much bigger than daylilies or irises, and, if the leaves, the stems are up, the leaves are up, would it make sense to cut off the stems before you move it? Just while you're lifting, yes. You wouldn't have to. It would maybe be more manageable. Since we're going to be cutting them back to 6 inches anyway, could you do that before the move? You got it.
I would do that before the move.
Okay.
Yeah, because like you say, there's quite a bit of foliage and stems.
Yeah.
And they're kind of getting in the way as you're trying to work with it. So definitely. Yeah. In fact, I'd probably even go down to maybe like the 3 to 4 inches. I think I said 4 to 8 but I'd even cut them back 3 to 4 inches above, and then it'll just be so much more manageable. So that's a good point, John. I would do that before I even start digging.
All right.
Yep, that'll be so much easier.
Now I'm going to have to go out and look in the yard and see what needs to be cut and moved.
Yes, and I got our iris done. I don't have a peony that's got to be moved yet, but I've got lots of daylilies that need dividing, so I'm going to be doing that shortly.
That sounds good.
Probably this weekend.
Well, if people have questions for how to dig and divide anything in their yard, or if they just want to send you pictures of what's growing in their yard now, what's the best way to reach you?
Email donald.kinzler, KINZLER, @ndsu.edu. Gosh, that's fascinating. Thank you for all those of you who have emailed. That's just awesome. It's fun to see, fun to share what everybody is doing. And yeah, so that's awesome. And thanks very much for listening.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. We'll talk to you next week.
Yeah, thank you, John. Have a great week.